When Margaret Chin walked into my office 18 years ago, she was holding a single piece of paper. Her hands weren't shaking. She wasn't crying. She looked me straight in the eye and said 5 words that would launch the longest, most complex estate battle of my career. My brother forged my father's will. I'd heard accusations like this before. Grief makes people suspicious. Disappointment makes them paranoid. In 20 years of practicing estate law, I'd seen dozens of family members convinced their relatives had been cheated, only to discover the will was legitimate and they simply hadn't been left as much as they'd hoped. But Margaret wasn't like those clients. She placed that single piece of paper on my desk with the precision of someone laying down a winning card. "This is my father's real signature," she said, pulling out a second document. "I have 20 examples, bank documents, contracts, letters. I've already had them analyzed by a handwriting expert. And this," she tapped the will, "isn't even close." Margaret Chin was 42 years old, a research scientist at a major pharmaceutical company. She had a PhD in molecular biology, spoke 3 languages, and had co-authored papers in prestigious journals. She was methodical, brilliant, and absolutely certain she was right. Her father, David Chin, had died 3 months earlier at the age of 73. He'd built a commercial real estate empire over 40 years, starting with a single apartment building in Chinatown and eventually owning properties across 3 states. The estate was valued at approximately $18 million. According to the will that had been submitted for probate, everything, 100% of the estate, went to Margaret's older brother, Thomas. "Tom and I weren't close," Margaret explained, her voice steady despite the betrayal in her words. "But we weren't enemies either. Dad always said he'd split everything equally between us. He told me that 100 times. He had the same will for 20 years, 50-50, me and Tom. Then Dad gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, 2 years of decline. The last 6 months, he couldn't recognize me half the time. He couldn't sign his own name." She pulled out another document, a medical report. "This is from Dad's neurologist, dated 4 months before he died. Dad's MMSE score, that's the mental status exam, was 12 out of 30. Severe cognitive impairment. He couldn't remember what year it was. He couldn't draw a clock. He couldn't spell world backwards." "And the will?" I asked. "Dated 2 months before he died. Supposedly signed at Tom's house with Tom's business partner and Tom's attorney as witnesses. No independent party present. No doctor to verify Dad's mental capacity. Just Tom, his friends, and a father with advanced Alzheimer's signing away $18 million. Margaret leaned forward. "I'm not doing this for the money. I don't need it. I make a good living. But my father built that empire from nothing. He came to this country with $200 and a dream. He sacrificed everything for me and Tom. And I will not let Tom steal his legacy and pretend it's what Dad wanted." I took the case. The first thing I did was subpoena all of David Chin's medical records from the last 3 years of his life. What I found was damning. David Chin had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 31 months before his death. The progression had been steady and unforgiving. Doctors' notes documented increasing confusion, memory loss, and difficulty with basic tasks. 16 months before his death, he'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store he'd shopped at for 20 years. 12 months before his death, he'd forgotten his daughter's name during a family dinner. 8 months before his death, his neurologist had recommended he stop driving. 6 months before his death, the neurologist had written, "Patient shows severe cognitive decline, unable to manage finances or make complex decisions. Recommend immediate appointment of conservator or power of attorney." The will in question had been signed exactly 2 months before David Chin's death. I filed a petition to contest the will, citing lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. Thomas Chin's attorney, a sharp litigator named Robert Ashford, filed a response that was aggressive and dismissive. He claimed Margaret was a disgruntled daughter trying to overturn her father's clear wishes. He claimed David Chin had been sharp as a tack until the day he died. He claimed the medical records were irrelevant because David had good days and bad days. The first hearing was set for 6 months later. In the meantime, I began investigating Thomas Chen. What I found was interesting. Thomas was 50 years old, 8 years older than Margaret. He'd worked in their father's real estate business his entire adult life, starting as a property manager and eventually becoming the company's CEO. On paper, he was successful, expensive house, luxury cars, country club membership. But when I dug deeper, I found something troubling. 3 years before David Chen's death, Thomas had taken out a $2 million loan against one of the company's properties. The loan documents showed it was for business expansion, but there was no business expansion. The money had disappeared. I hired a forensic accountant. It took her 6 weeks to trace the money. Thomas had a gambling problem, a serious one. Over 3 years, he'd lost approximately $3.5 million at casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. He'd depleted his own savings, maxed out his credit cards, and then started borrowing against company assets that technically belonged to his father. When David Chen's Alzheimer's made him unable to oversee the business, Thomas had essentially had free reign over the company finances, and he'd used that access to cover his gambling debts by quietly selling off properties and pocketing the proceeds. By the time David Chen died, the company that was supposed to be worth $18 million was actually worth closer to $12 million. Thomas had siphoned off $6 million to feed his addiction. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The will that left everything to Thomas had been signed exactly 2 weeks after David Chen's accountant had discovered discrepancies in the company books. The accountant had scheduled a meeting with David to discuss the missing money. Thomas had known he was about to be discovered. And suddenly, miraculously, there was a new will giving him complete control of everything. I presented all of this evidence at the first hearing. Robert Ashford fought back hard, arguing that Thomas's financial problems were irrelevant to whether David Chen had testamentary capacity. Judge Harrison Martinez, an experienced probate judge in his early 60s, listened carefully to both sides. "This is a complex case," Judge Martinez said at the end of the hearing. "We have questions of mental capacity, questions of undue influence, and questions about the validity of the will itself. I'm ordering an independent handwriting analysis of the signature on the contested will. I'm also ordering depositions of all witnesses who were present when the will was allegedly signed. We'll reconvene in 6 months." As we left the courtroom, Margaret pulled me aside. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I haven't told you yet." We went back to my office. Margaret sat down and pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos. About 5 years before Dad got sick, he told me something. We were having dinner, just the two of us. He'd had a few drinks, which was unusual for him, and he said, "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you about your family. Something that happened a long time ago." She looked up at me. He said that when he first came to America, before he married my mother, he had a relationship with another woman. She got pregnant. Dad offered to marry her, but she refused, said she wanted to raise the child alone. Dad gave her money for years, child support, essentially, but he never met the child, never had a relationship with them. "So you have a half-sibling somewhere," I said. "Had," Margaret corrected. Dad said the woman died when the child was in their 20s. He tried to reach out to the child, his child, but they wanted nothing to do with him, so he respected that and stayed away. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because 2 months ago, I got a letter from someone named James Chen. He says he's Dad's son. He says he deserves a share of the estate, and he says he has a will, a different will, that proves Dad wanted to include him." I sat back in my chair. This case had just gotten exponentially more complicated. James Chen's attorney contacted me a week later. His name was Michael Torres, and he was professional but firm. He sent over a copy of the will James was claiming was valid. This will was dated 4 years before David Chen's death, long before the Alzheimer's diagnosis. It divided the estate into 3 equal parts, 1/3 to Thomas, 1/3 to Margaret, and 1/3 to my son, James Chen, born to Rachel Wong on April 15, 1970. My client is willing to settle this quietly, Michael said over the phone. He doesn't want to drag the family through a public battle, but he has a right to his inheritance. David Chen was his father, and David wanted to provide for him. How do we know this will is legitimate? I asked. We'll submit to any testing you want, handwriting analysis, forensic document examination, whatever. James has nothing to hide. And how do we know James Chen is actually David Chen's son? DNA test. We're willing to do that too. We have David Chen's DNA from his medical records. Compare it to James. We're confident the results will prove paternity. This changed everything. If James's will was legitimate and dated before the contested will, it might supersede both Thomas's version and any claims Margaret had. But first, we had to verify that James was actually David Chen's son. The DNA test came back 3 weeks later. James Chen was a 99.98% match to David Chen. He was definitely David's biological son. I met with James and his attorney to hear his story. James was 51 years old, 9 years older than Thomas. He'd grown up knowing that David Chen was his biological father, but his mother had insisted they have no relationship. My mother was proud, James explained. He was a quiet, serious man who worked as a civil engineer. She didn't want my father's money. She wanted to prove she could raise me on her own. And she did. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Why come forward now? I asked. Because my father reached out to me. About 5 years before he died, he wrote me a letter saying he wanted to make amends, that he'd made mistakes, but he wanted to be part of my life. And we started meeting for coffee. Slowly, we built a relationship. James pulled out a stack of letters, all in David Chen's handwriting. He told me about Thomas and Margaret. He said he loved all 3 of his children, but he'd failed me for so long. He said he wanted to make it right. That's when he had the new will drawn up. Did Thomas and Margaret know about you? Margaret did. Dad told her, but he never told Thomas. He said Thomas wouldn't understand, that Thomas had always been difficult about sharing. The case now had 3 competing wills. 1, the original will from 20 years ago, everything split 50-50 between Thomas and Margaret. 2, the will James was presenting, everything split 3 ways, including James. 3, the will Thomas was using, everything to Thomas. Judge Martinez ordered a full trial to determine which will was valid. The trial was scheduled to begin in 8 months. During those 8 months, I prepared the most complex case of my career. I hired 3 handwriting experts to analyze all the signatures. I deposed everyone who'd ever witnessed David Chen signing a document. I collected medical records, financial records, and testimony from everyone who'd known David in his final years. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The handwriting experts all agreed the signature on Thomas's will was not David Chen's. It was a forgery, and not even a particularly good one. The person who'd forged it had clearly tried to copy David's signature, but had gotten several key features wrong. The angle of the letters, the pressure points, the flow of the pen. But here's what shocked me. The signature on James's will was also questionable. It looked more like David's signature than Thomas's version, but it had inconsistencies too. The experts couldn't definitively say it was forged, but they couldn't confirm it was authentic either. Something didn't add up. I called Margaret into my office and laid out what I'd found. Both wills have problems, I told her. Thomas's is definitely a forgery, but James's has issues too. I think someone else is involved here. Someone who had access to your father's signatures and financial information. Who? Margaret asked. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I went back to David Chen's financial records and started looking at who had access to his accounts, his properties, his business. Thomas, obviously. But there was someone else, someone who'd been David Chen's personal assistant for the last 15 years of his life. Her name was Linda Park. She was 63 years old, had worked for David since she was 48, and had been completely trusted with everything: passwords, bank accounts, property deeds. She'd been like family to David, especially after his wife died 10 years ago. I subpoenaed Linda Park's financial records. What I found was damning. 3 months after David Chen's death, Linda had purchased an $800,000 house in Florida, cash, no mortgage. For someone whose salary had been $65,000 a year, that was impossible unless she'd come into money some other way. I dug deeper. Linda had also purchased a new car, taken expensive vacations, and made several large cash deposits into her personal account over the past year. The total, approximately $1.2 million. I brought this information to the prosecutor's office. They opened a criminal investigation into Linda Park for embezzlement and fraud. When confronted, Linda Park broke down and confessed everything. She'd been embezzling from David Chen for years, starting small but getting bolder as his Alzheimer's worsened and he became unable to track his finances. She'd written checks to herself, transferred money to her accounts, and even sold some properties and pocketed the proceeds. But the embezzlement wasn't the worst of it. Linda Park had forged the will that Thomas was using. Thomas had come to her after discovering his father's Alzheimer's was advancing, desperate because he knew his gambling debts and theft from the company were about to be discovered. He'd begged Linda to help him. Linda had seen an opportunity. She'd forge a will giving everything to Thomas, and in exchange, Thomas would give her $2 million once he inherited. Thomas had agreed, but Thomas had never intended to pay her. Once he had the forged will, he'd planned to cut Linda out entirely. The trial became a media circus from day one. Local news crews camped outside the courthouse. Headlines screamed, "Secret Sun surfaces an $18 million estate battle and Alzheimer's patient's will forged," prosecutors say. The trial was scheduled for 3 weeks, but everyone knew it would go longer. Judge Martinez had cleared his entire docket to handle this case. It was that complex, that important, and that likely to set precedents for future estate litigation. Opening statements began on a Monday morning in September, almost 2 full years after Margaret had first walked into my office. I stood before the jury, 12 ordinary people who would decide the fate of an $18 million estate, and told them David Chen's story. David Chen came to America with $200 and a dream, I began. He worked 7 days a week. He saved every penny. He bought his first property, a rundown apartment building, with money he'd borrowed from everyone he knew. He spent nights fixing broken pipes and days collecting rent. And slowly, over 40 years, he built an empire. I paused, making eye contact with each juror. David Chen had 3 children. Thomas, his oldest, who worked in the family business. Margaret, his daughter, who became a research scientist. And James, a son David didn't meet until late in life, a son born from a relationship David had before his marriage, a son he supported financially but didn't have a relationship with until 5 years before his death. I pulled out a timeline chart showing the jury the progression of David's Alzheimer's disease alongside the dates of the contested wills. This case is about what happens when an elderly man with severe Alzheimer's becomes vulnerable. When the people he trusted most, his son, his personal assistant, saw his declining mind not as a tragedy but as an opportunity to steal, an opportunity to forge, an opportunity to take everything he'd built and divide it according to their greed, not his wishes. Robert Ashford, Thomas's attorney, gave his opening statement next. He was smooth, confident, aggressive. "The plaintiff wants you to believe that Thomas Chen is a villain," Ashford said, "a greedy son who manipulated his sick father. But the evidence will show something very different." Thomas Chen dedicated his life to his father's business. While his sister was off pursuing her own career, Thomas was working 80-hour weeks to build that empire. He earned every penny his father left him. Ashford gestured dismissively at James, who sat in the gallery. As for Mr. James Chen, He appears out of nowhere after David Chen dies, conveniently holding a will that benefits him. Who's to say that will is real? Who's to say James Chen isn't the real fraud here? The first witness was Dr. Patricia Reynolds, David Chen's neurologist. I'd deposed her months earlier, and she'd been unequivocal about David's condition. Dr. Reynolds, I began after she was sworn in, you treated David Chen for how long? 3 years, from the time he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's until his death. Can you describe his condition in the last 6 months of his life? Dr. Reynolds pulled out her notes. Mr. Chen had severe cognitive impairment. His MMSE, mini mental state examination, scores had declined from 24 out of 30 when he was first diagnosed to 12 out of 30 6 months before his death. That's a significant decline. What does a score of 12 out of 30 mean in practical terms? It means Mr. Chen couldn't remember what year it was. He couldn't recall the names of his family members. He couldn't draw a simple clock. He couldn't do basic math. He required assistance with daily activities like dressing and eating. In your professional opinion, did David Chen have the mental capacity to understand and execute a will 2 months before his death? Absolutely not, Dr. Reynolds said firmly. At that point, Mr. Chen couldn't understand complex legal documents. He couldn't comprehend the consequences of his decisions. In my opinion, he lacked testamentary capacity. Robert Ashford's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Doctor, you said Mr. Chen had good days and bad days, correct? Yes, that's common with Alzheimer's patients. So it's possible that on the day he signed the will, he was having a good day? No, Dr. Reynolds said flatly. By 2 months before his death, Mr. Chen didn't have good days in the sense you're suggesting. He had days where he was slightly more alert, but he was never cognitively functional enough to execute a will. But you weren't there when he signed the will, were you? No, but I saw him regularly. I reviewed his medical charts. Based on his trajectory, I can say with medical certainty that he lacked capacity at that time. Ashford tried a few more angles but got nowhere. Dr. Reynolds was unshakable. The second witness was crucial, Dr. Sandra Kim, one of the handwriting experts I'd hired. She'd analyzed the signatures on all 3 wills, and her testimony would be devastating to Thomas's case. I projected images of David Chen's signature on a screen for the jury, dozens of examples from bank documents, contracts, letters spanning decades. Dr. Kim, you've examined over 50 examples of David Chen's authentic signature, correct? Yes, from various time periods throughout his life. And you've also examined the signature on the will that Thomas Chen submitted for probate? I have. What did you conclude? Dr. Kim stood and approached the screen, using a laser pointer to highlight specific features. David Chen's authentic signature has several consistent characteristics. See here, the angle of the D is always about 45 degrees. The loop in the H crosses at a specific point. The spacing between letters is consistent. These are unconscious features that are very difficult to forge. She switched to the image of Thomas's will. Now look at this signature. The angle of the D is wrong. It's about 60 degrees. The loop in the H crosses too high. The spacing is inconsistent. Moreover, there are what we call tremor lines. These little shakiness marks that appear when someone is carefully drawing a signature rather than writing it naturally. What's your conclusion? This signature is a forgery, and not a particularly sophisticated one. Whoever forged it tried to copy David Chen's signature, but didn't have the fine motor control to replicate the unconscious features that make a signature unique. The jury was leaning forward, fascinated. Dr. Kim, did you also examine the signature on the will presented by James Chen? I did. And what did you conclude about that signature? That signature is authentic. It matches all the characteristic features of David Chen's real signature. The angle, the pressure points, the flow, everything is consistent. More importantly, it was written naturally, not drawn. You can see the confidence in the pen strokes. On cross-examination, Ashford tried to undermine Dr. Kim's credentials, her methodology, her conclusions, but she'd testified in over 200 cases and had been qualified as an expert in federal court. Ashford barely made a dent. The third day of trial brought Linda Park to the stand. She'd already pleaded guilty to embezzlement and forgery, but we needed her to testify about Thomas's involvement. Linda looked haggard. Prison was clearly taking its toll. She'd aged 10 years in the 18 months since her arrest. "Ms. Park," I began, "you worked for David Chen for 15 years, correct?" "Yes." "And during that time, did you embezzle money from him?" "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "How much?" "About $1.2 million total, over about 5 years." "Did you forge the will that Thomas Chen submitted for probate?" Linda looked at Thomas, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. Then she looked down at her hands. "Yes." "Why?" "Because Thomas asked me to. He said his father was going to disinherit him because he'd found out about the gambling and the money Thomas had stolen from the company. Thomas said if I helped him, he'd give me $2 million from the inheritance." "And did he pay you?" "No. Once he had the forged will, he cut me off, wouldn't return my calls. I realized he'd never intended to pay me." Ashford's cross-examination was brutal. "Ms. Park, you're a confessed embezzler and forger, correct?" "Yes." "You're currently serving a 6-year prison sentence?" "Yes." "And you're testifying here today as part of a plea deal that reduced your sentence, correct?" "Yes." "So you have every incentive to lie and blame my client for your crimes, don't you?" Linda looked up, and for the first time, there was steel in her voice. "I don't need to lie. I did horrible things. I stole from a sick old man. I forged a legal document. I deserve to be in prison, but Thomas Chen was my co-conspirator. He knew exactly what he was doing. And if I'm going down, he should too." The fourth day of trial was when we called James Chen to the stand. His testimony would be crucial. We needed the jury to see him not as an opportunist, but as David Chen's legitimate son. "Mr. Chen," I began gently, "tell us about your mother, Rachel Wong." James's voice was quiet but steady. "My mother was a seamstress. She came to the United States from Hong Kong in 1968. She met my father, David Chen, in 1969. They had a brief relationship. When she got pregnant, David offered to marry her, but she refused." "Why?" "My mother was proud. She didn't want to trap a man into marriage. She wanted to raise me on her own, to prove she could do it." "Did David Chen provide financial support?" "Yes. He sent money every month until I turned 18. He offered to continue, but my mother refused. She said I was an adult now and should make my own way." "When did you first meet David Chen?" "Not until I was 46 years old, 5 years before he died. He wrote me a letter saying he wanted to know me, that he'd made a mistake staying away all those years." "What was your relationship like?" James's eyes welled with tears. "It was good. We met for coffee once a month at first, then weekly. He told me about his life, his business, his other children. I told him about my work, my family, my life. We were building something. And then the Alzheimer's started taking him away." "Did David Chen ever discuss his will with you?" "Yes. About 4 years before he died, he told me he wanted to include me. He said he had 2 children already, Thomas and Margaret, and now he wanted to acknowledge his 3rd child. He said it was the right thing to do. He had his lawyer draw up a new will, splitting everything 3 ways. Did Thomas Chen know about you?" James hesitated. "Margaret knew. David told her, and she accepted me immediately. But David never told Thomas. He said Thomas had issues with money, that Thomas wouldn't understand why David was giving away part of his inheritance to someone he'd never met. Ashford's cross-examination was vicious. Mr. Chen, convenient that you showed up after David Chen died, isn't it? I didn't show up. I'd known him for 5 years. But you waited until after his death to make your claim to the estate. Because I didn't know about the will until after he died. David had told me he'd updated his will to include me, but I didn't know the details. How convenient. It's the truth. You're a civil engineer, correct? Yes. You make a good living? I do fine. But $6 million would be better than fine, wouldn't it? James's voice hardened. I didn't do this for the money. I did it because David Chen was my father, and he wanted me to be part of his family. That's worth more than any amount of money. The 5th day brought the most dramatic testimony, Margaret Chen. I'd prepared her extensively, but you can never fully prepare a client for the emotional intensity of testifying about their parents' decline and death. Margaret wore a simple navy suit. Her hair was pulled back. She looked professional, composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Ms. Chen, I began, tell the jury about your father. Margaret took a deep breath. My father was the strongest person I've ever known. He came to this country with nothing. He worked harder than anyone I've ever met. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes like we all do, but he was fundamentally good. He believed in honesty, hard work, and family. What was your relationship with your father like? Very close. Growing up, I'd help him collect rent from tenants. He'd take me to properties and teach me about real estate. He always said to me, Margaret, you're smart. You can do anything. Don't limit yourself. He's the reason I became a scientist. When did you first notice changes in your father's mental state? Margaret's voice caught. About 3 years before he died. Little things at first. He'd forget appointments, repeat the same story twice in one conversation, get confused about dates. Then it got worse. He'd get lost driving to familiar places, forget my name, not recognize me sometimes. How did that make you feel? Heartbroken. My strong, brilliant father was disappearing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Did your father ever discuss his will with you? Many times. He had the same will for 20 years. Everything split 50-50 between me and Thomas. Then, about 5 years before he died, he told me about James, about his other son. He said he wanted to update his will to include James, that it was the right thing to do. Did he do that? Yes. He had a lawyer draw up a new will, splitting everything 3 ways. He told me about it. He was happy about it. He said, now I can die knowing I did right by all my children. What happened next? Margaret's expression darkened. Dad's Alzheimer's got worse. Thomas took over more of the business. And then, 2 months before Dad died, Thomas told me Dad had signed a new will. Everything to Thomas, nothing to me or James. What did you think? I knew immediately it was wrong. Dad would never do that. Even with Alzheimer's, even in his confusion, his fundamental values didn't change. He loved all his children. He wouldn't cut me out. And he certainly wouldn't pretend James didn't exist. Ashford's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Margaret as a bitter daughter who couldn't accept her father's decision to favor his son. Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you and your brother Thomas never got along? We had our differences, but we weren't enemies. Isn't it true that you resented Thomas working in your father's business while you pursued your own career? No, I was proud of what Thomas built. At least I was before I found out he'd been stealing. Allegedly stealing. No, Margaret said firmly. Actually stealing. The forensic accounting proved it. Ms. Chen, have you considered that maybe your father did change his mind? That maybe he decided Thomas, who'd devoted his life to the business, deserved more? Margaret leaned forward, her eyes locked on Ashford. My father was a fair man. Even if he'd wanted to give Thomas more, which I doubt, he would never have given him everything. He would never have erased me and James like we didn't exist. That's not who he was. and the fact that you're suggesting otherwise shows you never knew him at all." The courtroom was silent. Even Ashford seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The sixth day of trial brought what everyone had been waiting for: Thomas Chen taking the stand. Thomas's attorney had advised against it. "Never put your client on the stand in a case like this," is what we tell law students. But Thomas had insisted. He wanted to tell his side of the story. He was sworn in and took his seat. At 52 years old, Thomas looked every day of it. The stress of the trial, the criminal charges, the media attention. It had all taken a visible toll. Ashford led him through his background, how he'd started working for his father at age 22, how he'd learned the real estate business from the ground up, how he'd eventually become CEO of the company, how he'd devoted his entire adult life to building his father's empire. "Mr. Chen," Ashford said, "did you forge your father's will?" "No," Thomas said firmly, "I did not." "Did you ask Linda Park to forge your father's will?" "No." "Linda Park testified that you conspired with her to forge the will. Is she lying?" "Yes, Linda embezzled over $1 million from my father. She's trying to reduce her own culpability by blaming me." It was a decent performance, but I'd been practicing law long enough to recognize when someone was lying. Thomas's body language screamed deception, the way he wouldn't quite make eye contact, the way his hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair, the way his voice went up slightly on certain words. I want you to understand what was happening in Thomas's mind at this moment. Years later, in therapy, Thomas would describe this day on the witness stand as the moment he realized he'd become someone he didn't recognize. As Robert Ashford asked him the scripted questions, "Did you forge the will? Did you conspire with Linda Park?" Thomas heard his own voice saying no, and knew he was lying. He thought about his father, not the David Chen with Alzheimer's, confused and deteriorating, but his father from 20 years ago, strong, principled, a man who'd started with nothing and built an empire through honest work. What would that man think of his son now? Thomas knew the answer. His father would be devastated, ashamed, heartbroken that the son he'd groomed to take over the business had instead stolen from it, that the son he'd trusted had forged his will. But Thomas had spent so long justifying his actions. "I earned this, I deserve this, I worked for this," that he'd convinced himself the lies were truth. The gambling debts, just bad luck. The theft from the company, just borrowing against future earnings. The forged will, just ensuring he got what he deserved. Except now, sitting in this witness chair, facing Margaret's attorney, facing the jury, facing the truth, Thomas could feel the house of cards collapsing. He thought about his own children, his sons, in their 20s, sitting in the gallery watching their father testify. What were they thinking? Did they believe him? Or did they see through the lies the same way the jury clearly did? Thomas remembered a conversation he'd had with his father 10 years ago, before the Alzheimer's, before everything went wrong. They'd been reviewing company finances, and Thomas had suggested some creative accounting, ways to minimize taxes, maximize profits, bend the rules without quite breaking them. His father had looked at him with disappointment. "Thomas, I didn't build this company by cutting corners. I built it with honest work. If we start lying about our finances, we become liars. And once you become a liar, you can never go back." "But Dad, everyone does this. It's just smart business." "No," David had said firmly, "it's cheating. And cheating is for people who don't believe they can win fairly." "Are you saying you don't believe in yourself enough to succeed honestly?" Thomas had dropped the suggestion. But the seed had been planted. The idea that rules were flexible, that winning mattered more than how you won, that the ends justified the means. Now, sitting on this witness stand, Thomas realized his father had been right. Once you start lying, you can never go back. He'd told his first lie to cover his gambling debts, then another lie to cover the missing money, then forged a will to cover everything. Each lie required another lie to support it until he was buried under a mountain of deception. And now he was here, under oath, lying to a judge and jury about forging his father's will. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Once you become a liar, you can never go back. But Thomas couldn't stop now. He'd gone too far. Admitting the truth meant prison, bankruptcy, losing everything. So he kept lying even as he felt a piece of himself die with each false word. When I approached the witness box to begin my cross-examination, Thomas looked at me and thought, She knows. She knows I'm lying. They all know. And in that moment, Thomas Chen realized he'd lost more than just the case. He'd lost himself. When Ashford finished, Judge Martinez looked at me. Counselor, your witness. I stood and approached the witness box slowly. Mr. Chen, you testified that you devoted your life to your father's business, correct? Yes. And you believed you'd earned your inheritance through that work? Yes. So you felt entitled to more than an equal share? I didn't say that. But you thought it, didn't you? You thought, I worked for this. Margaret left to pursue her own career. Why should she get the same amount I get? Thomas hesitated. Maybe sometimes I thought that, but I never acted on it. Didn't you? I pulled out financial records. Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you took out a $2 million loan against company property 3 years before your father's death? That was for business expansion. Really? Where's the expansion? Show me the properties you bought with that money. Show me the business investments. Silence. You can't, can you? Because you didn't use that money for business. You used it to pay gambling debts. I had some financial difficulties. I pulled out more documents. Casino records show you lost $3.5 million in 3 years. You maxed out 6 credit cards. You borrowed from friends, from business associates, from anyone who'd lend you money. You were desperate. Thomas's face was red. I had a problem. I admit that, but it has nothing to do with the will. Doesn't it? Your father's accountant discovered discrepancies in the company books. He scheduled a meeting with your father to discuss missing money. That meeting was supposed to happen in 2 weeks. I held up the will. This will is dated exactly 1 week after that meeting was scheduled, 1 week after your father was going to find out you'd been stealing from him. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? I didn't forge that will, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Your father had severe Alzheimer's. His doctor said he couldn't even remember what year it was. But somehow he signed a complex legal document giving you everything. And the only witnesses were your business partner and your attorney, people who had a vested interest in keeping you happy. My father had good days. Your father, I said, my voice rising, couldn't draw a clock. He couldn't spell simple words. He didn't recognize his own daughter half the time. But you want this jury to believe he was mentally competent enough to disinherit her and pretend his other son didn't exist? I didn't know about James, Thomas shouted. Dad never told me about him. Exactly, I shot back. Your father never told you because he knew you wouldn't accept it. He knew you were greedy. He knew you'd resent having to share your inheritance with someone else. So he updated his will without telling you, splitting everything 3 ways, ensuring all his children were taken care of. That's not, and when you found out about that will, when you realized you were only getting 1/3 instead of half, or better yet, everything, you decided to fix the problem. You got Linda Park to forge a new will, one that gave you everything, one signed by a man who couldn't even remember his own name. Thomas was sweating now. No, that's not what happened. Then tell me what happened, because the forensic evidence shows that the signature is forged. Your co-conspirator confessed and implicated you. The timeline lines up perfectly with your need to cover up your theft. What am I missing?" Thomas looked at his attorney, then at the jury, then back at me. My father wanted me to have the business. He knew I'd earned it. By stealing from him? I was going to pay it back. With what money? You'd already gambled away everything you had. Thomas's composure was cracking. "You don't understand. I built that company as much as he did. I worked 80-hour weeks while Margaret was off playing scientist. I earned that money." "So you did feel entitled to more?" Yes, I felt entitled. Is that what you want to hear? I devoted my life to that company. My father promised me I'd take it over someday. And then suddenly he's talking about bringing in some stranger, this James person I'd never even met, and giving him a third of everything? That's not fair. "So you forged the will?" "No, Linda did that on her own. I swear, I didn't know she was going to do that. But you benefited from it." Thomas stopped, realizing the trap he'd walked into. "You benefited from a forged will, a will that disinherited your sister and erased your half-brother from existence, a will signed by a man with severe dementia. And when that will was presented to the court, you didn't say, 'Wait, something's wrong here. My father wouldn't do this.' You said, 'Great, I'll take my $18 million now.'" Thomas didn't answer. "No further questions," I said. The damage was done. Thomas had essentially admitted on the stand that he felt entitled to more than his siblings, that he'd resented the three-way split, and that he'd benefited from a forged will even if he claimed he didn't personally forge it. The seventh day of trial featured the financial expert testimony. My forensic accountant, Rachel Morrison, walked the jury through every dollar Thomas had stolen from the company and every dollar Linda had embezzled. The company should have been worth approximately $18 million, Rachel explained, using charts and graphs to illustrate her findings. But by the time David Chen died, it was only worth about $12 million. $6 million had disappeared. "Where did it go?" I asked. Thomas Chen had systematically siphoned money from the company to cover his gambling debts. He'd sell properties and pocket the proceeds, claiming the sales were at market value when they were actually sold at a loss to buyers he'd arranged. He'd create fake expenses and write checks to shell companies he controlled. It was an elaborate scheme of self-dealing. And Linda Park's embezzlement? Separate but concurrent. She was writing checks to herself, transferring money to her accounts, even forging David Chen's signature on bank documents to authorize transfers. Between Thomas and Linda, they'd stolen approximately $7.2 million from David Chen's estate over 5 years. The jury looked horrified. This wasn't just a family dispute over a will. This was systematic theft from an elderly man with dementia. The eighth day brought character witnesses. We called David Chen's friends, business associates, and neighbors, people who'd known him for decades. They all told the same story. David Chen was honest, fair, and deeply committed to family. He talked about all 3 of his children with pride. He'd never shown favoritism. He'd been excited about getting to know James in his final years. And most importantly, multiple witnesses testified that David had told them about updating his will to include James. He said, "I finally get to be a real father to all my children." One friend testified. He was happy about it. He said it was the right thing to do. And another witness, David's accountant of 30 years, testified. David called me about 4 years before he died. He said, "I need to update my will. I have 3 children now, not 2. Make sure they each get a third." He was very clear about that. On the 9th day, we rested our case. Judge Martinez looked at Ashford. "Defense?" Ashford stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Martin Webb." Dr. Webb was a neurologist Ashford had hired as an expert witness. His job was to argue that David Chen could have had sufficient mental capacity to sign the will 2 months before his death. It was a long shot, and everyone knew it. Dr. Webb testified that Alzheimer's patients can have periods of lucidity, that cognitive tests don't tell the whole story, that it's theoretically possible David Chen could have understood what he was signing. But on cross-examination, I destroyed him. Dr. Webb, you never met David Chen, correct? That's correct. You never examined him? No. You never reviewed his actual medical records, only summaries provided by the defense. I reviewed what I was given. And you're being paid $15,000 for your testimony here today? I'm being compensated for my time, yes. Dr. Webb, David Chen's actual neurologist, Dr. Reynolds, who treated him for 3 years, testified that he lacked capacity. Are you saying she's wrong about her own patient? I'm saying it's possible she's mistaken about his capacity at that specific moment. Based on what? Your extensive review of a case summary? Your deep knowledge of a patient you never met? Based on my expertise in neurology. Dr. Webb, have you ever testified as an expert witness in a case where you contradicted the treating physician's opinion? Yes, several times. And in those cases, who hired you? The plaintiff or the defendant? Usually the defendant. Always the side paying you to disagree with the treating physician? I provide my honest professional opinion. An opinion that just happens to align with whoever's paying your $15,000 fee. Judge Martinez sustained Ashford's objection, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Dr. Webb for what he was, a hired gun willing to say whatever the defense needed him to say. Ashford called a few more witnesses, people who claimed David Chen had seemed sharp shortly before his death, Thomas's business associates who testified about his dedication to the company, but none of it was enough to overcome the mountain of evidence against Thomas. On the 10th day, both sides gave closing arguments. Ashford went first, making one last attempt to paint Thomas as a devoted son who'd earned his inheritance. The plaintiff wants you to believe Thomas Chen is a monster, Ashford said, but the evidence shows a man who devoted 30 years to his father's business. Yes, he had a gambling problem. Yes, he made mistakes. But that doesn't make him a forger. Linda Park forged that will on her own, and she's trying to drag Thomas down with her. Then it was my turn. I approached the jury box and spoke quietly, forcing them to lean in and listen. Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't complicated. David Chen was a good man who built something remarkable. He had 3 children, Thomas, Margaret, and James. He wanted to treat them all fairly. 4 years before he died, while he still had full mental capacity, he updated his will to split everything 3 ways. I held up the authenticated will. This is David Chen's real will, examined by 3 independent handwriting experts, authenticated by forensic document analysts, dated to when David Chen still had capacity, still had cognition, still knew who he was and what he wanted. I walked over to the defense table and picked up Thomas's forged will. This is a fraud. The signature is forged. The witnesses were Thomas's friends. The timing is suspicious, right after David's accountant discovered Thomas had been stealing. And most importantly, it contradicts everything we know about who David Chen was as a person. I returned to the jury box. Thomas Chen stole from his father. Linda Park stole from his father. And when they realized David Chen was going to discover their crimes, they forged a will to cover it all up. They betrayed a sick old man who trusted them. I paused, making eye contact with each juror. Your job is to honor David Chen's real wishes, not what Thomas wanted, not what Linda wanted, what David wanted. And David wanted all 3 of his children to share equally in the legacy he'd built. I held up a photo of David Chen, a professional portrait from better days, when his eyes were sharp and his smile was genuine. David Chen can't speak for himself anymore. Alzheimer's took his voice long before death took his life. But his real will, signed when he was still himself, still capable, still the man who built an empire from nothing, that will speaks for him. And it says, I love all my children equally. I want them all to share in what I've built. I want them to be a family. I placed the photo on the evidence table where the jury could see it, honor his voice, validate his wishes, Give David Chen the justice he deserves. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Margaret, James, and I waited in a small conference room in the courthouse. The first day was agonizing. Every hour that passed felt like a week. Margaret paced. James sat quietly, his hands folded. I answered emails and pretended I wasn't as nervous as they were. "What if we lose?" Margaret asked at one point. "We won't," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "But what if we do? What if the jury believes Thomas? Then we appeal. But Margaret, we presented overwhelming evidence. 3 handwriting experts, David's neurologist, the forensic accountant, Linda Park's confession, the timeline of Thomas's theft. The jury would have to ignore all of that to find for Thomas." "Juries do unexpected things," Margaret said. She was right, of course. I'd seen juries make bizarre decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with evidence. A charming defendant, a sympathetic story, a single juror who refused to budge. On the afternoon of the second day, we got the call. The jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. Thomas sat at the defense table, his face pale. His attorney looked resigned. He knew this wasn't going well. Judge Martinez entered, and we all stood. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury foreman, a woman in her 50s who'd been taking copious notes throughout the trial, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." "In the matter of the estate of David Chen, we find that the will dated 4 years before the decedent's death, dividing the estate equally among Thomas Chen, Margaret Chen, and James Chen, is the valid last will and testament." Margaret grabbed my hand and squeezed. I could feel her shaking. "We further find that the will submitted by Thomas Chen is a forgery and is invalid. We find that Thomas Chen conspired with Linda Park to forge said will and to defraud the estate." But before the judge could dismiss us, something extraordinary happened. Margaret stood. "Your Honor, if I may, there's one more piece of evidence I'd like to present to the court. It was discovered just last week." Judge Martinez raised his eyebrows. "The trial is over, Ms. Chen. The verdict has been read." "I understand, Your Honor, but this isn't evidence that would change the verdict. It's a letter from my father to all 3 of his children. I think the court should hear it." Judge Martinez looked at me. I nodded. I'd seen the letter. Margaret had found it in her father's safe deposit box just days ago, and we debated whether to present it during trial. We decided it wasn't necessary for the legal case, but Margaret felt strongly that it should be part of the public record. "Very well," Judge Martinez said. "You may read the letter." Margaret walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a single piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly. James sat forward in his seat. Thomas, for the first time all trial, looked directly at his sister. Margaret took a deep breath and began to read. "To my 3 children, Margaret, Thomas, and James. If you're reading this, I am gone. My mind has been going for a while now. The doctors tell me it's Alzheimer's, that it will only get worse. And I want to write this while I still can, while I still know who I am and who you are. Thomas, my son, you've worked for me for 30 years. You've built this company as much as I have. But I know about the gambling. I know about the money you've taken from the company to cover your debts. I found out 6 months ago, and I've been trying to figure out what to do about it. I'm disappointed, Thomas, deeply disappointed. But I'm also your father, and I still love you. Addiction is a disease, and you need help. I hope you get it. I hope you find the strength to overcome your demons before they destroy you. The money you took, consider it your advance on your inheritance. The rest will be split 3 ways. Margaret, my brilliant daughter. You've never needed me the way Thomas did. You've built your own life, your own career, your own success. I'm so proud of you. You remind me of myself when I was young, stubborn, independent, unwilling to take the easy road. Fight for what's right, Margaret, but also fight for forgiveness. Don't let anger consume you. Life is too short for grudges. James, my son, who I failed for 50 years, I should have been your father from the beginning. I should have ignored your mother's pride and my own fear and fought for a relationship with you. Those 50 years are my biggest regret, but I'm grateful for the 5 years we've had. Our coffee meetings have been the highlight of my weeks. Getting to know you, learning about your life, your family, your work, has been a gift I didn't deserve. I'm leaving you 1/3 of my estate, not because you need it, but because you deserve to be recognized. You're my son. You're part of this family. I should have said that 50 years ago, but I'm saying it now. You belong to all 3 of you. I know this inheritance might cause conflict. I know Thomas will be angry about the 3-way split. I know Margaret will be angry when she finds out what Thomas did. I know James will feel guilty for taking money from a family he barely knows, but I want you to know something. You are all my children. I love you all equally. The money is just money. The real inheritance I'm leaving you is each other. Thomas, you have a sister who will forgive you if you let her. Margaret, you have 2 brothers who need you. James, you have siblings who will welcome you if you give them a chance. Take care of each other. Be a family. That's all I ever wanted. Love isn't about deserving. It's about belonging. You all belong to each other now. With all my love. Your father, David Chin. The courtroom was silent. Margaret was crying. James was crying. Even some of the jurors were wiping their eyes. And Thomas had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, clearly moved. Thank you, Ms. Chen, for sharing that. It provides important context for this court's decision. He looked at Thomas. Mr. Chen, your father knew what you'd done. He knew about the gambling, the theft, everything. And his response wasn't to disinherit you. It was to give you an equal share anyway, because you were his son. He gave you love and forgiveness. And you repaid him by forging his will and trying to steal from your siblings. Thomas looked up, his face streaked with tears. I hope someday you understand what you've lost, Judge Martinez said. Not the money, your father's trust, your siblings' respect, your own integrity. Those things are worth far more than any inheritance. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her purse. As we left the courtroom, she put her arm around James. Did you hear that? She said quietly. We belong to each other. Dad said so. James nodded, unable to speak. Behind them, Thomas stood alone, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. Thomas closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped. We recommend that the court impose sanctions on Thomas Chen for his fraudulent conduct and award attorney's fees to the plaintiffs. Judge Martinez thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then he turned to us. The court accepts the jury's verdict. The will dated 4 years before David Chen's death is hereby declared the valid will. The estate shall be divided equally among the 3 children. Thomas Chen is ordered to pay $400,000 in attorney's fees and costs to the plaintiffs. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution of Thomas Chen for fraud and conspiracy. He banged his gavel. We're adjourned. As we left the courtroom, reporters swarmed us. Margaret made a brief statement. Justice has been served. My father's real wishes have been honored. That's all that matters. James said nothing, but I could see the relief in his eyes. He'd been fighting not just for money, but for recognition, for the validation that he was truly David Chen's son and deserved to be treated as such. Thomas left through a side door, surrounded by his attorneys, avoiding the cameras and questions. The next 18 months were a whirlwind of legal aftermath. Thomas was arrested 3 weeks after the verdict. The district attorney charged him with fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Thomas's defense was weak, essentially arguing that he'd been manipulated by Linda Park, that he hadn't known the will was forged. The jury didn't believe him. He was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, Judge Harrison spoke directly to Thomas. "Mr. Chen, you betrayed your father in the worst possible way. You stole from him when he was vulnerable. You forged his will when he couldn't defend himself. You tried to erase your siblings from his legacy, and you showed no remorse until you were caught." Thomas stood silent, his eyes downcast. "This court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison and orders you to pay restitution of $6 million to the estate. You will also be prohibited from serving as executor, trustee, or conservator of any estate for the rest of your life." The bailiff led Thomas away in handcuffs. His wife, who'd stood by him throughout the trial, finally filed for divorce. 2 months later, his children, 2 boys in their early 20s, were devastated and struggled with whether to maintain a relationship with their father. Meanwhile, the estate was finally distributed. But as I'd warned Margaret and James, there was far less than the original $18 million. Thomas had stolen $6 million. Linda had embezzled $1.2 million. Legal fees for both the civil trial and criminal prosecution had consumed another $900,000. Some properties had declined in value during the years of litigation. Others had to be sold quickly to pay debts, resulting in below-market prices. When the dust settled, the estate was worth approximately $9 million. Divided 3 ways, each heir received just under $3 million. Margaret took the news philosophically. $3 million is more than most people ever see, she said. I'm grateful for it, but the money was never really the point. It was about honoring Dad's wishes and making sure James was recognized. She invested most of her share in the David Chen Scholarship Fund, which she established to help first-generation immigrant students attend college. The fund gave out its first scholarships 2 years after the trial, 10 students, $10,000 each. Dad would have loved this, Margaret said at the first scholarship ceremony. He believed in education, in hard work, in giving people opportunities. This is his real legacy. James, true to his word, donated half his inheritance, $1.5 million, to Alzheimer's research. I watched my father disappear, James told me when he made the donation. I'd finally gotten to know him, and then the disease took him away. If this money can help find a cure or even just slow the progression, then it's worth it. He used the other half to pay off his mortgage, set up college funds for his kids, and finally take his family on the vacation to Hawaii they'd been putting off for years. Money doesn't buy happiness, James said, but it does buy security and options. I'm grateful for both. The relationship between the 3 siblings evolved slowly over the years. Margaret and James had bonded during the legal battle. They'd been allies, united against Thomas's fraud. After the case ended, they stayed in touch. Coffee every few weeks, family dinners on holidays. Their children became close. James's daughter even babysat Margaret's kids. Thomas was the difficult one. For the first 2 years after his conviction, Margaret and James had no contact with him. He was in prison, and neither felt ready to engage with the man who tried to cheat them out of their inheritance. But then something shifted. Thomas completed a residential addiction treatment program in prison. He started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He wrote letters to Margaret and James, not asking for forgiveness, not making excuses, but acknowledging what he'd done and expressing genuine remorse. I destroyed our family, one letter read. I was so consumed by my addiction, my entitlement, my greed, that I convinced myself I deserved Dad's entire estate. I told myself I'd earned it. I told myself you and James didn't understand the business. But the truth is, I was just greedy, and I hurt everyone I loved. Margaret showed me the letter. What do you think? Do you want a relationship with him? I asked. I don't know. Part of me does. He's still my brother. We grew up together. We have the same father. But another part of me can't forget what he did, how he forged Dad's will, how he tried to erase me and James, how he stole from our father while Dad was sick and vulnerable. You don't have to decide now, I said. Give it time. 3 years after Thomas's conviction, he was released from prison. He'd served his full sentence. The parole board had denied early release, citing his lack of cooperation and continued minimization of his crimes. Thomas emerged a different man, or at least he seemed to be. He moved into a small apartment and took a job as a property manager for a residential complex, working for someone else, not running his own company. His salary was modest, $55,000 a year, but it was honest work, and for the first time in his life, Thomas seemed at peace with that. He continued his GA meetings. He started therapy to address not just his gambling addiction, but the deeper issues, his need for control, his fear of inadequacy, his complicated relationship with his father, and slowly, tentatively, he reached out to Margaret and James. The first meeting was awkward. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, on a Saturday morning 6 months after Thomas's release. Margaret brought me along for support, though I stayed at a table across the room, giving them space. Thomas looked older, thinner, worn down by prison and consequences. He didn't try to hug Margaret or shake James's hand. He just sat down and said, "Thank you for coming." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the forgery and the theft, but the betrayal. I took Dad's death, this horrible, painful thing, and made it even worse by fighting over money." Margaret's voice was cold. "You did more than fight over money. You tried to erase us from Dad's life, from his legacy. I know. You forged his signature. You conspired with Linda. You stole from him for years before he even died. I know. And you stood in court and lied about it." Thomas nodded. "I know. I did all those things, and I can't undo any of it. The best I can do is acknowledge it and try to be better." James finally spoke. Why? Why did you do it?" Thomas was silent for a long time then. "Because I felt like I deserved it, like I'd earned it. I worked for Dad for 30 years. I sacrificed my own dreams to build his company, and then when he got sick, when I saw how much money we had, I wanted it, all of it. I didn't want to share." He looked at James. "And when I found out about you, after Dad died, when your will surfaced, I was furious. I thought, who is this stranger coming to take what's mine? I didn't see you as a person. I didn't see you as Dad's son. I just saw you as competition." "I am Dad's son," James said quietly. "You are," Thomas agreed. "You deserved everything Dad wanted to give you, and I'm sorry I tried to take that away." Margaret stood up. "I can't do this right now. This is too much." She walked out. James stayed a few minutes longer, then left as well. I joined Thomas at his table. He looked defeated. "I lost them," he said. "Not necessarily," I replied. "Healing takes time. You can't undo years of damage in one conversation." "Will they ever forgive me?" "Maybe, maybe not, but you can't do this for their forgiveness. You have to do it because it's the right thing to do." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're right. I wish I could go back, make different choices." "We all do," I said. "But we can't. We can only move forward." It took another 2 years, but gradually the relationships began to heal. Margaret invited Thomas to her daughter's birthday party, not as a guest of honor, just as another attendee. Thomas came, brought a modest gift, stayed for an hour, and left without drama. 6 months later, James invited Thomas to a family barbecue. Thomas came, met James's wife and kids, helped flip burgers, and had actual conversations that didn't revolve around apologies and guilt. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Thomas would never be fully trusted again. He'd never be invited to major family events as a central figure. He'd always be the brother who betrayed them, the one who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with money or responsibility. But he was family, and family, Margaret decided, meant giving people a chance to be better. 10 years after the trial, I attended a ceremony at the university where the David Chen Scholarship Fund had its headquarters. Margaret was being honored for her philanthropic work. The scholarship fund had grown to $5 million and was supporting 50 students per year. At the ceremony, Margaret gave a speech. "My father, David Chen, came to this country with $200 and a dream," she began. "He worked harder than anyone I've ever known. He built an empire, and when he died, that empire became the center of a legal battle that lasted years and tore our family apart." She paused, scanning the crowd. I saw James sitting in the third row, and in the back, standing near the exit as if ready to leave at any moment, was Thomas. "But something good came from that battle," Margaret continued. "It forced us to confront what really matters. Not money, not property, not who gets what. What matters is integrity, family, forgiveness, legacy." She gestured to the students in the audience, scholarship recipients, all first-generation immigrants or children of immigrants. "These students are my father's real legacy, not the properties he built, not the money he accumulated. These students pursuing their dreams, working hard, creating their own success. They're what Dad would be proud of." After the ceremony, I saw the three siblings standing together, talking quietly. Not warmly, there was still distance, still pain, but together. Margaret had her father's strength, James had his father's quiet dignity. Thomas had learned, finally, his father's values. It wasn't the family David Chen had hoped to leave behind, but it was the family that had survived the war over his estate. Scarred, yes, changed, definitely, but still standing, still connected, still family. The end. The will dated 4 years before David Chen's death, naming Thomas Chen, Margaret Chen, and James Chen as equal beneficiaries, is hereby deemed valid and enforceable. The will submitted by Thomas Chen is determined to be a forgery and is invalid. The estate will be divided equally among the 3 children. But by this point, there was a new problem. The estate had been decimated. Thomas had stolen $6 million. Linda had embezzled $1.2 million. Legal fees had consumed another $800,000. The properties had declined in value during the years of litigation. What remained was approximately $9 million. Split 3 ways, each heir would receive about $3 million. Margaret had spent 18 months fighting for justice and would end up with far less than she would have gotten under her father's original 50-50 will. I asked her once if she regretted it, if she wished she'd just accepted Thomas's initial settlement offer of $2 million and walked away. "No," she said without hesitation. "This was never about the money. It was about making sure my father's real wishes were honored. James deserved to be recognized as Dad's son. Thomas deserved to face consequences for what he did. And Linda deserved to go to prison for stealing from a sick old man." She paused. $3 million is more than most people ever see. I'm grateful for it. But the real inheritance Dad gave me was integrity. And I wasn't going to dishonor that by letting Thomas and Linda get away with fraud. The aftermath of the case took another 2 years to fully resolve. Thomas Chen pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $6 million, money he didn't have. He declared bankruptcy, his house was foreclosed, his wife divorced him, his children stopped speaking to him. By the time he was released from prison, Thomas Chen had lost everything. He was working as a property manager for someone else's company, living in a small apartment, and trying to rebuild relationships with his kids, who wanted nothing to do with him. Linda Park pleaded guilty to embezzlement, forgery, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $1.2 million. She sold her Florida house, her car, everything she'd bought with stolen money. It still wasn't enough to cover what she'd stolen. But before I get to the resolution, I need to tell you about something James shared with me years later. Something that explained why he'd fought so hard, not just for the money, but for recognition. 6 months before David Chen died, James's mother, Rachel Wong, was also dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She had weeks left, maybe days. James sat by her hospital bed, holding her frail hand. She was 73 years old, had worked as a seamstress her entire life, and had never once asked David Chen for more than the child support he'd voluntarily given. "James," she whispered, her voice weak, "I need to tell you something about your father." "Mom, you should rest." "No, I need to say this." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "When David wanted to be part of your life, I said no. For 50 years, I kept you apart. I told myself it was pride, that I didn't need his money or his name, that we were fine on our own." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd love him more than me. Afraid you'd see how much more he could give you. Afraid I'd lose you. So I kept you from your father, and I kept him from his son. Mom, when he reached out to you 5 years ago, I was angry at first. But then I saw how happy it made you, how you'd come home from your coffee meetings with him, smiling, talking about real estate and business and family. You glowed, James, like a part of you that had been missing was finally found." She coughed, a wet, painful sound. "If David left you anything, money, property, anything, please don't feel guilty taking it. You're his son. You deserve to be recognized. You deserve to inherit. Don't let my pride keep you from claiming what's yours." "What if his other children fight it?" James asked. "Thomas and Margaret, they don't even know I exist." "Then you fight back," Rachel said firmly, with a flash of the strength that had carried her through decades of single parenthood. "You fight for your place in that family, not because of the money, because you're David Chen's son, and that means something." She died 3 days later. When James received the letter from Michael Torres about the will, he almost didn't respond. The guilt of claiming his father's money felt overwhelming. His mother had never taken more than child support, and here he was, potentially fighting for millions. But then he remembered her final words, "You deserve to be recognized." So he fought, not for the money, though he was honest enough to admit it would help, but for the validation that he was truly David Chen's son, that he belonged to this family, that his existence mattered. That's why when the verdict came in and the will naming him as an equal heir was validated, James cried. Not tears of joy over the money, but tears of relief that his mother had been right. He did deserve to be recognized. He was David Chen's son. And now, finally, legally, officially, everyone knew it. James Chen took his $3 million and did something unexpected. He donated half of it to Alzheimer's research. "My father's disease destroyed him," James told me when he announced the donation. "I watched him decline. I saw what it did to him, to his family, to everyone who loved him. If I can help fund research that might prevent another family from going through this, then this money will have served a good purpose." James used the other half to pay off his mortgage and set up college funds for his 2 children. He continued working as a civil engineer. He stayed in touch with Margaret, and slowly they built a sibling relationship. I want to tell you about the first time Margaret and James met face to face. It happened 3 months before the trial started, after DNA results confirmed James was David Chen's biological son, but before anyone knew whose will would prevail. Margaret called me. "I want to meet him, James, my brother, half-brother, whatever he is." "Are you sure? The case is still ongoing. Meeting could complicate things." "I know, but I need to look him in the eye. I need to know if he's real, if this whole thing is real." I arranged the meeting at a neutral coffee shop in downtown. I sat at a table nearby, ready to intervene if things went badly. James arrived first. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, professional but not flashy. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, his hands folded on the table, waiting. Margaret arrived 10 minutes later. She saw James immediately. There was something in his profile, in the set of his jaw, that was unmistakably David Chen's. She froze in the doorway. I watched as she took 3 deep breaths, squared her shoulders, and walked over to his table. "James?" He stood quickly. "Margaret, thank you for meeting me." They shook hands, formal, awkward, then sat across from each other. For the first 5 minutes, neither spoke. They just looked at each other, searching for signs of their shared father in each other's faces. Finally, Margaret said, "You have his eyes." "So do you," James replied. Another long silence. "This is so strange," Margaret said, a laugh bubbling up that was half amusement, half hysteria. "I have a brother I never knew about. For 42 years, I thought I had one sibling. Now there's 2. "I'm sorry," James said quietly. "I never wanted to disrupt your family, your life. But when your father, our father, reached out to me, I couldn't say no. I'd spent 50 years wondering about him." "Tell me about him," Margaret said suddenly. "Tell me about the coffee meetings. What did you talk about?" James smiled, the first genuine emotion either had shown. "Everything. Business, mostly at first. He wanted to know about my work as an engineer. I wanted to know about real estate. But then we started talking about other things. His childhood in Hong Kong, my mother, why they didn't stay together." "What did he say about that?" "He said it was his biggest regret, that he'd been young and stupid and let pride keep him from being my father. He said he'd sent money, child support, but that wasn't the same as being present. He said he'd wasted 50 years being too proud to admit he had a son." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "That sounds like Dad, always taking responsibility for his mistakes." "He talked about you too," James said. "He was so proud of you. He'd say, my daughter is a scientist. She's brilliant. She could have worked in the family business, but she wanted to do something more. That's what I love about her. She follows her own path." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "He said that?" "All the time. He said you reminded him of himself, stubborn, independent, unwilling to take the easy road." Margaret wiped her eyes. "He never told me about you. I found out at his funeral when a woman came up and said she was your wife. I was so shocked, then angry, then confused. Why didn't he tell me?" "He wanted to," James said. "He told me he planned to, but then the Alzheimer's started, and he said the timing never felt right. He was worried about how you'd react, if you'd accept me." "I would have," Margaret said immediately. "I mean, it would have been a shock, but I would have accepted you. You're his son. That makes you my brother." James looked down at his coffee. "Even though I'm claiming a third of his estate? Is that what this is about for you? The money?" "No," James said firmly. "I make a good living. My wife works too. We're comfortable. The money would be nice, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because for 5 years I had a father, a real father, not just a monthly check. And when he died, I wanted to honor that relationship. The will he made, including me, that was him saying I mattered, that I was his son. That's what I'm fighting for." Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then we're not enemies," she said. "We both want the same thing, to honor Dad's real wishes, the will he made 4 years ago, splitting everything 3 ways. That's what he wanted. That's his real legacy." "What about Thomas?" James asked. Margaret's expression hardened. "Thomas forged a will. He's trying to steal from both of us, from all of us, including Dad. So yes, we're fighting Thomas, but you and I, we're on the same side." James smiled, genuinely this time, with relief evident on his face. "I'd like to get to know you, if that's okay. Not because of the inheritance, but because we're family." "I'd like that too," Margaret said. And for the first time since their father's death, she felt like something good might come from this whole terrible situation. They stayed at the coffee shop for 3 hours that day, sharing stories about David Chen, about their childhoods, about the strange situation they found themselves in. By the time they left, they weren't quite friends. That would take time. But they were allies, and more importantly, they were family. Margaret took her $3 million and created the David Chen Scholarship Fund for first-generation immigrant students pursuing degrees in business or science. She also wrote a book about her experience called The Inheritance War, which became a bestseller and helped fund the scholarship program even further. Dad came to this country with nothing, Margaret said at the Scholarship Fund's launch event. He built something incredible through hard work and integrity. This scholarship will help other people do the same. That's the real inheritance, not money, but opportunity, not wealth, but values. 3 years after the case concluded, I received a letter from Margaret. She'd gotten married, was expecting her first child, and wanted me to know that she was naming the baby David after her father. I want my child to know about their grandfather, she wrote. Not just that he was wealthy, but that he was a good man who made mistakes, tried to fix them, and ultimately wanted to do right by all his children. I want them to understand that family isn't just about blood or money. It's about integrity, forgiveness, and choosing to do what's right even when it's hard. 5 years after the case, I ran into Thomas Chen at a coffee shop. He was with a woman I didn't recognize. Later, I learned she was his AA sponsor. He'd been sober for 3 years, working on his gambling addiction. He looked older, worn down by prison and consequences. When he saw me, he didn't avoid eye contact. He walked over. "I want you to know I'm sorry," he said. His voice was quiet, genuine. Not just for what I did to Margaret and James, but for what I did to my father's legacy. I was so consumed by my own problems, my own addictions, that I convinced myself I deserved all the money, that somehow I'd earned it by working in his company. He paused. I stole from him. I lied to him. I forged his will, and I almost got away with it. If Margaret hadn't fought back, if she'd just accepted the settlement, I would have destroyed everything my father built and felt justified doing it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to know that Margaret was right about all of it. I was wrong, and I'm trying to be better. I'll never get back what I lost, my inheritance, my family's trust, the relationship with my father, but maybe I can at least learn from it." Thomas started to walk away, then turned back. "Tell Margaret, if you ever talk to her, that I'm proud of her for fighting, for not giving up, for protecting Dad's real legacy. She's more like him than I ever was." 7 years after the case, James Chen's daughter graduated from college with a degree in molecular biology. Margaret attended the graduation, sitting with James's family. In the program, under acknowledgments, James's daughter had written, "To my grandfather, David Chen, who I never got to meet, but whose values of hard work, integrity, and family live on through the people who loved him." 10 years after the case, I received an invitation to Margaret's second child's baptism. The baby's middle name was Thomas. "I wanted my brother back," Margaret explained when I asked about the name. "We lost so many years to that court battle, but Tom's been sober for 7 years now. He's working hard to rebuild his life. He's trying to be a better person. And I decided that forgiveness is also part of Dad's legacy." She smiled. "Besides, Tom and I have the same father. That means something. It doesn't erase what he did, but it means we have a chance to build something new. Dad would have wanted that." This case taught me lessons that go far beyond estate law. First, greed destroys families faster than any disease. Thomas had been set to inherit millions, but it wasn't enough. He wanted everything, and his greed cost him not just money, but relationships, freedom, and respect. Second, Alzheimer's and dementia make elderly people incredibly vulnerable to exploitation. David Chen was lucky that Margaret fought for him. Many victims of elder abuse have no one to speak up for them. Third, secrets always come out. David Chen's secret son, Thomas's gambling addiction, Linda's embezzlement, all of it eventually surfaced. Trying to hide the truth only makes the eventual exposure more painful. Fourth, forgery is almost never perfect. Modern forensic techniques can detect even sophisticated forgeries. If you're considering forging a will or any legal document, understand that you will likely be caught and the consequences will be severe. Fifth, document everything. Margaret's father had kept meticulous records of his real estate empire. Those records helped prove what Thomas had stolen and what Linda had embezzled. Without documentation, proving fraud becomes nearly impossible. Sixth, mental capacity matters. A will signed by someone with severe Alzheimer's is not valid, no matter how many witnesses were present. If you're dealing with an elderly family member who shows signs of dementia, document their mental state carefully and ensure any legal documents are signed while they still have capacity. Seventh, estate planning shouldn't wait. David Chen had meant to update his will to include James, and he had, but if he'd waited any longer, his Alzheimer's would have prevented him from doing so legally. If you have complex family situations, address them in your estate planning sooner rather than later. Eighth, hidden children happen more often than you'd think. James wasn't the first secret child I've encountered in estate cases, and he won't be the last. These situations are always painful for everyone involved. Ninth, the cover-up is worse than the crime. If Thomas had just admitted to his gambling problem and his theft from the company, he might have faced consequences but could have rebuilt his life much faster. Instead, the forgery added years to his legal troubles and destroyed any remaining family trust. And finally, justice is slow but often inevitable. It took 18 months just to get to trial, another 2 years to resolve all the criminal charges, another 3 years for Thomas and Margaret to begin rebuilding their relationship. Justice isn't always fast, but when pursued with determination and integrity, it usually prevails. 15 years after the case, yes, 15 years, I received an email from Margaret. She attached a photo, her, James, and Thomas standing together at David Chen's grave on what would have been his 88th birthday. "We finally made it back to being a family," Margaret wrote. "It took almost 2 decades. But we got there. Tom is 5 years sober and has been working hard to make amends. James and I have become close. He's the brother I never knew I needed. And together we've kept Dad's scholarship fund going, helping dozens of students achieve their dreams." She continued, "The money from the inheritance is long gone, invested in homes, education, charity. But the real inheritance Dad left us wasn't money. It was a lesson in what matters: integrity over wealth, family over fortune, and forgiveness over bitterness." The photo showed 3 middle-aged siblings, arms around each other, smiling at their father's grave. In front of the headstone were 3 bouquets of flowers, one from each child. I printed that photo and put it on my office wall right next to my law degree, because that photo represents something more important than any legal victory. Proof that even the most broken families can heal, given time, effort, and genuine desire to do what's right. The inheritance war lasted 18 months in court, 2 years in criminal proceedings, and 15 years to full family reconciliation. By any legal standard, it was one of the longest, most complex cases I've ever handled. But in the end, everyone got what they really needed. Not necessarily what they wanted, but what they needed. Thomas needed to hit rock bottom to confront his addictions and rebuild his character. He got that, painfully. James needed to be recognized as David Chen's son and welcomed into the family. He got that, eventually. Margaret needed justice for her father and validation that she was right to fight. She got both. And David Chen, His estate was divided equally among all 3 of his children, just as he'd intended in that will he signed 4 years before his death. His legacy lives on in scholarships for immigrant students, and his children, all 3 of them, ultimately came together to honor his memory. That's not the ending anyone expected when Margaret walked into my office with a single piece of paper and an accusation of forgery. But it's the ending David Chen deserved. And sometimes that's all that matters. 20 years after David Chen's death, Margaret called me. She was now 62, a grandmother, still working as a research scientist, though semi-retired. "I found something," she said, "in Dad's safe deposit box. The bank just now notified us it existed. There was some administrative confusion, and the box had been missed during the estate settlement." "What was in it?" "A letter addressed to all 3 of us, me, Thomas, and James, dated 6 months before Dad died, right around the time his Alzheimer's was getting really bad. He must have written it during one of his lucid moments." "What did it say?" Margaret's voice caught with emotion. He knew Thomas was stealing from the company. He knew about the gambling. He'd found out. But he also knew his own mind was failing and he wouldn't be able to confront Thomas properly. She paused. The letter said, "To my 3 children, Margaret, Thomas, and James. By the time you read this, I will be gone. Thomas, I know what you've done. I know about the money, the gambling, the theft. I'm disappointed, but I still love you. You're still my son. I hope you find the strength to overcome your demons. Margaret, I know you'll fight for what's right. That's who you are. Fight for justice, but also fight for forgiveness. Don't let anger consume you the way addiction consumed your brother. James, I'm sorry it took me so long to be your father. I wasted 50 years being too proud to admit I had a son. Those years are my biggest regret. I hope you can find it in your heart to be part of this family because you deserve to be recognized for who you are." Margaret was crying now. And then he wrote, "I'm leaving everything split 3 ways, not because it's equal. Thomas stole, so it's not fair to him. But because you're all my children. Love isn't about deserving, it's about belonging. You all belong to each other now. Take care of each other. Be a family. That's all I ever wanted." There was a long silence on the phone. "He knew everything," Margaret finally said. "He knew, and he still wanted us to be together. Even knowing Thomas had betrayed him, even knowing the family would fall apart fighting over his estate, he still had faith that eventually we'd find our way back to each other." "He was right," I said. "Yeah," Margaret agreed. "It took 20 years, but he was right." That letter never made it into the court record. It was found too late, and legally, it wouldn't have changed anything anyway. But for Margaret, Thomas, and James, it changed everything, because it proved that their father, even in the fog of Alzheimer's, even in the final months of his life, had understood what really mattered, not the $18 million, not the properties or the business or the wealth, but family, forgiveness, love. That was David Chen's real inheritance. And unlike the money that got spent, stolen, or given away, that inheritance will last forever.